The Jets need to find the next Adonai Mitchell this week, and nothing would be bigger for this team than its rookie tight end having a breakout game against the Miami Dolphins. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Friday, December 5th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and thanking you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. I'd like to give a big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And our episode today is brought to you by FanDuel. If you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. On today's show, we are previewing Week 14 action. The New York Jets hosting the Miami Dolphins Sunday at MetLife Stadium. Kickoff time scheduled for 1 p.m. Eastern. The Jets, of course, are coming off a win last weekend against the Atlanta Falcons, and a win is very good to have. But for the Jets, the biggest development from that game was the breakout performance by Adonai Mitchell, because it's all about the future. It's all about developing young talent. On today's show, we're going to talk about 3 players who could be this week's Adonai Mitchell, 3 young players who could be due for a breakout performance. We'll talk about a rookie corner who has seen his snap count go up after the Sauce Gardner trade. We'll talk about a young defensive tackle who has seen his snap count go up after the Quinnen Williams trade. And we'll talk about a rookie tight end who has gotten a lot of reps this season, gotten a lot of experience, and now it's time to expand his role. And that rookie tight end is, of course, Mason Taylor. You know, heading into the season, I tried to preach patience with Mason Taylor. There were Jets fans, and this happens every year around the NFL draft. And I think it happens with all 32 teams, and it's understandable. You get excited, you see a prospect's highlight video, you see about his physical tools, and you think the guy's going to come in and dominate the league right off the bat. And it frequently doesn't happen. It almost never happens at the tight end position. Tight end's a spot where it takes a while to get going in the NFL. You know, the normal caveats apply. There are just lots of things that every player has to adjust to in the NFL. Frequently, your playbooks are more complicated. Frequently, you're running, especially at a receiver position, you're running more complex routes. No matter which position you play, though, the job becomes more complex in the NFL. You're facing opposition that's better, in every way. Faster, bigger, stronger, has a better sense of the game. It's a difficult transition to the NFL. When I was thinking about what Mason Taylor would do this year, I figured that he'd get a lot of reps early in the season. And I figured that, the production would not be spectacular. Mason Taylor's come in around the high end of what I was expecting. He hasn't really dominated. I think, though, given the circumstances, considering this is a rookie and a 21-year-old rookie at that. So a guy who's a pretty young rookie whose game needed some refinement entering the NFL. I'm pretty happy with where he is right now through the first 13 weeks of the season. He's got 39 catches. He got 318 yards. He's got a touchdown. He's held his own. I'll put it this way. He has not looked overmatched. And even if he had looked overmatched through the first 13 weeks of the season, I don't think it would be a big deal, because this was very much a guy who was in need of development. And I think on a lot of other teams, he would not see a huge snap count this year. On a better team, you'd be able to ease him into the lineup more. You'd have at least one quality tight end in front of him, maybe 2, and he'd get on the field. He'd run a handful of routes he was comfortable with. He'd get in and run concepts that he understood how to run. That did not happen with the Jets, because the Jets were so lacking in talent at the tight end position. This was a team that really had nothing other than Mason Taylor. So he's had to step into the lineup. And I think the Jets have kept it relatively simple for him. They've had him run a lot of short routes this season, and he's generally been pretty reliable. When his numbers come up, they've thrown him the ball, and he's caught it. And, again, you have to grade on a curve, even for a second-round pick. It's not easy to enter the NFL. I think that based on what we've seen so far, I like the trajectory Mason Taylor is on. But now we're entering December. And one of the things I mentioned, starting from the draft, going all the way through the offseason, even through the early part of this season, is that Mason Taylor was going to get a lot of game reps. And the results may not be spectacular through the first 3 months of the season. Again, because he's a guy in need of development. But these game reps could pay real dividends once we get to December, and especially once we get into year 2. I think it's time for Mason Taylor to see his role expanded on this offense because he's really been more of a short route guy, and he's run short routes pretty well. He's been a check down guy, but the Jets haven't really tried to get him the ball down the field. I mentioned this on yesterday's crossover show with my buddy Kyle Krabs of Locked On Dolphins that Jets have only thrown 10 yards, 10 passes past 10 yards down the field for Mason Taylor this year. And because of that, because he's been used as a check down guy, he's catching a decent number of passes, but he's not putting up huge production. He's only averaging 8.2 yards per reception. And that's pretty low. That's a pretty low number. And I'm not blaming Mason Taylor. I'm saying it's his usage. And I understand why the Jets have used him this way. Because again, it's a tough transition. Really, really tough to break into the NFL. I wasn't expecting him to come in and dominate the league the way Brock Bowers did last year, or the way Tyler Warren's played this year for the Indianapolis Colts. Because Taylor's a second round pick. There's a reason those guys went in the first round. There's a reason Taylor went in the second round. It takes some time. But I think that if the Jets are going to maximize Taylor, and you have to remember, the Jets drafted him pretty early in the second round. You don't draft a tight end early in the second round if you want him to just be okay. And the way the Jets have used Taylor so far this season, if they keep using him like this through the rest of his career, he's going to be just an okay tight end. He's not a guy who's been particularly dynamic after the catch. Now, if you're going to be a short target and you're a great after the catch guy, that's one thing. Next Gen Stats keeps numbers on yak yardage, yards after the catch. And there are only 10 guys who qualify with enough catches who have a lower average after the catch than Taylor. Next Gen Stats also uses some complex algorithms, and they come up with how many yards you should have after the catch. Taylor's averaging negative 0.8 yards versus expected after the catch. So essentially, Next Gen Stats algorithms based on where players are at any given point in time say that Taylor should have 0.8 of a yard more per catch after the catch than he does right now. So essentially, he's not a great after the catch guy. Only 3 guys have worse numbers in that area. So what all of this means is that Mason Taylor is not really going to be a guy who's going to excel in the short game. You got to get him open down the field. Now, the good news for the Jets is that Taylor is just very smooth with his movements. That was one of the things that really struck out to me scouting him out of LSU is usually big guys, it takes them a while to stop and start when they change direction. Taylor's just a very fluid athlete, a very fluid mover. So I think the Jets have got to start working him more in the intermediate game. I'm not sure he's going to be a great deep threat. I'm not sure he's going to be a downfield threat the way Adonai Mitchell hopefully will be. But I think the Jets can use him more in the intermediate part of the field, get him going on some seam routes, work that middle of the field, particularly against teams that, don't have the greatest linebacker play. I think that this is the point in the calendar where I'm expecting Mason Taylor to take his game to the next level. And that can only happen if the Jets let Mason Taylor take his game to the next level. Again, I'm not criticizing Tanner Engstrand for his approach to Taylor so far. I think there's something to be said for a guy who is getting a lot of snaps, who may not have been completely ready for them, simplifying things, not making him a full focal point in the offense, just have him out there getting used to the speed of the NFL game, all the things you need to do to get him to adjust. But now we are 12 games in, and now you should have a good sense of the NFL game. So this is the time, I think, to expand his role, particularly in games where I don't want to say they're glorified exhibition games for the Jets because, look, they're still going out there trying to compete. You can see the way the team celebrated last week against Atlanta, that even though these games may not count for much in terms of playoff positioning, we know the Jets are going to finish with a losing season. These games matter for these players, particularly a team like the Jets, where you first-year coach, first-year GM trying to establish a culture. It may be a cliche, but I think in this case it's true. Young guys trying to establish themselves in the NFL, show they belong. I understand fans that want to root for the tank. I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to root for your team this time of year. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to support your team this time of year. But whether you or not you want the Jets to tank, the guys out in the field are going to go out there and compete because you have so many guys who are young, who are seeing reps for the first time in the NFL, who are trying to prove that they belong in this league. And the only way they can prove they belong in this league is succeeding. And if they succeed, Jets are likely to win games. The Jets need to put Mason Taylor in a position to succeed. Adonai Mitchell had his big breakout game last week. We want to see Mitchell do it again. We want to see him follow up on that, of course. And Mitchell probably is going to be the go-to guy this week off that great performance, but he needs help. There are other receivers who need to step up. Mason Taylor can be one of them. Jets are hoping they got a quality tight end in the draft. So far, I'm cautiously optimistic, but it's time to see Taylor take that next step. And during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about a guy who has been quietly taking the next step ever since the Quinnen Williams trade. Quinnen Williams is playing great football, but so is a guy who has seen an increased snap load, who in some ways has kind of taken his spot in the lineup. It could be a big game for Jowon Briggs. We'll discuss as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL Sundays move fast. One big play and suddenly everything feels different. That's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting. You're not just watching the game, you're reacting to it in real time. With FanDuel, you can place bets as the action unfolds. Every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment. Live betting is best when the game starts to shift. A receiver gets hot, a defense tightens up, or the momentum flips after a turnover. And FanDuel lets you jump into the moment with live spreads and money lines adjusting instantly, player props updating as guys heat up. You can even bet the next touchdown scorers, drive results, totals, and more. It keeps you locked into every snap, every drive, every possibility. Looking ahead to Sunday, Jets hosting the Miami Dolphins. Jets coming off a win. Dolphins still the favorite. 2.5 points right now is the line over at FanDuel. Miami's a road favorite in what should be a cold weather game. So if you want to get in on the action, FanDuel's the place to do it. And if you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. FanDuel, the game moves fast, and so can you. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're getting you ready for week 14 action. The New York Jets hosting the Miami Dolphins this Sunday at MetLife Stadium. Second meeting between these two AFC East rivals. Two teams having disappointing seasons, but two teams that have kind of been trending in the right direction over the last couple of weeks. The Jets got a win over the Atlanta Falcons last Sunday at MetLife Stadium, and they've now won 3 of their last 5 games. So look out for the Jets. And I think one thing you could say about this Jets team is that they are competitive. You don't, and I don't want to like read too much into like moral victories or anything like that, but this team has not been annihilated in many games recently. Even the games they lost against New England and Baltimore, they were, if not right in the games, they weren't wiped. They weren't completely blown out of those games. So the Jets, looking to build momentum. And there's a guy on the defensive line who's been quietly building momentum since the Quinnen Williams trade. He's a guy who's had a good season since the Jets acquired him before the start of the regular season from the Cleveland Browns. And that's Jowon Briggs. Sometimes you watch the games and you notice a guy who's playing really well, but you don't realize how well he's playing until you actually see some numbers. And that's kind of happened with me with Jowon Briggs. Because, I watch the games live, and then I go back and I watch the film. And the number of times I've said over the last 4 weeks, that Jowon Briggs is really playing well. Like Jowon Briggs is really impressing me. It's been high. But then I saw a statistic that our old buddy Michael Nania from JetsXFactor.com posted. And it kind of like encapsulates how well Briggs is playing. It notes that since the Quinnen Williams trade, Quinnen has the most pressures from the defensive tackle spot in the league with 21. He also has the highest pressure rate, 21.9%. So, look, the Jets gave up a great player in Quinnen Williams. There's no doubt that Quinnen Williams is a fantastic player that in order to get the draft picks they had to give up something really special. I hate that the Jets gave up Quinnen Williams. It could be for the greater good, though. And I think like part of the dynamic of the Quinnen Williams and Sauce Gardner trades is that it doesn't really matter how well these guys do with their new teams. Quinnen Williams can play fantastic football with Dallas, and he has. Sauce Gardner could play fantastic football with the Indianapolis Colts. But it doesn't matter if the Jets hit on the draft picks they get, because the success of those trades is not about what they gave up. It's about what they acquired. But of course, when you give up quality players, you need people to step in. Now, I'm not ready to say Jowon Briggs is a Quinnen Williams replacement. But as I mentioned, heading into this week at least, of course, the Cowboys played last night, but heading into week 14, since the Quinnen Williams trade, Quinnen has the most pressures from the defensive tackle spot in the league and the highest pressure rate. Jowon Briggs is number 2 in both areas. He's tied for second with 16 pressures and is second with a pressure on 19.3% of his pass rushing snaps. So Jowon Briggs is playing really good football. And I have to say that this is a bit of a surprise. I remember going back to after the trade was made, Briggs was a guy I mentioned a couple times as somebody who had an opportunity to step up in after the Quinnen Williams trade, just because the Jets didn't really have anybody else at the defensive tackle spot. I wasn't expecting him to step up like this, though. Now, 4 good games. I'm not ready to say that Jowon Briggs is the future starter at defensive tackle, but this is worth watching. He's playing really good football. I have to admit, when the Jets traded for him at the end of training camp, I was like, why did they do this? I didn't really get. This was a guy who was a 7th round pick who played okay with Cleveland last year, but not usually the guy you give up compensation for, even though the Jets really didn't give up much. It was a 6 for a 7 pick swap. Well, you know what? You got to give Darren Mucci some credit this one, and you got to give Aaron Glenn some credit for this one. So much of my faith in a front office and coaching staff is whether they can identify talent where nobody else can. And it's starting to look like they really did this with Jowon Briggs. Now, Jowon Briggs can go back to being the guy he was before the Quinnen Williams trade, where, he was a guy who played typically a handful of snaps a game. He came in when Harrison Phillips needed a rest. He was strong in the middle of the line. You couldn't push him around. He could eat up blocks. He was strong against the run. If he's that guy, trade's a pretty good one, because the Jets found a quality rotational player. But he's really picked up his game since the Williams trade, and his snap count's gone up. In the 4 games since the Jets traded Quinnen, he's played at least 30 snaps. And in the last 3, he's gotten at least 40 snaps. This was not a guy I was expecting to play a big role on the Jets this season. He was a guy I was expecting to maybe get, a snap count in the teens on a week-to-week basis. If something happened to Harrison Phillips, maybe, he'd see an increased workload in the short run. I was not expecting to be here in week 14 saying that, over the last 4 games, Jowon Briggs is the second best pass rusher at the defensive tackle spot in the league behind Quinnen Williams. It's time to continue it, though. Anybody, I don't want to say anybody can have a good month, but lots of guys in the NFL have had big months. The question in the NFL is, can you sustain it after you have a big month? And I don't want to take away anything from Jowon Briggs, because I think he was good before the Quinnen Williams trade. I think he was playing really solid football for the Jets. Again, I would sign up for what he did before the Quinnen Williams trade, because I think he was doing his job very effectively. I think, he had a role and he played it really well. Well, this opportunity this trade has presented an opportunity for Jowon Briggs, and he has taken it and run with it. And, if he keeps up this pace, you may look at him as a starting defensive tackle heading into next season. And that might be one less thing the Jets need to get. And that's important, because there are not a lot of spots that are settled on this team. You've got the 2 tackle spots I think are settled. Your number 1 wide receiver spot is settled. If you bring back Breece Hall, which I'm expecting them to do, your number 1 running back spot is settled. There aren't a lot of other spots, especially on the defensive side of the ball, because in order to get all these draft picks, the Jets had to trade the only 2 guys who were great players on that side of the ball. So this is a defense that essentially needs to be rebuilt from scratch. I mean, there are a few pieces here that they might have a couple answers at the corner position, which we'll talk about a little bit later on the show. So what you need right now from the Jets is you need some unheralded young guys to step up and show, we belong in this league, that we've got an opportunity to give you good football. Jowon Briggs has been doing that over the last month. And this week's a bit of a test for him, because Miami interior offensive line, it's been pretty good, particularly their center, Aaron Brewer. He's having a really good season, so this is going to be a good test for Briggs. And if he goes out there and has a big game, we could be on our way to really finding a gem here. And that would be a fantastic thing for this football team. One of the things I talked about this offline with somebody this week, and we were discussing, how a rebuild works in the NFL. So this was not on the podcast. This was just someone I was speaking with in real life. And I mentioned that one of the things you need to happen in this league for a rebuild to be successful is you need things to go right that you were not expecting to go right. And I think that Jowon Briggs' emergence as defensive tackle could be one of those things, because I think if the Jets were being honest, they weren't expecting this. I think they were expecting the guy early in the season who was the good backup nose tackle. I'm not sure they were expecting Jowon Briggs to play like this, though. I'm not going to say replacing Quinnen Williams, but playing really good football with an opportunity to get more snaps because of the Quinnen Williams trade. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a rookie. There's another player who saw his snap count increase because of the team's activity at the trade deadline. That is A.Z. Thomas. And this is going to be an interesting test this week for the rookie. Jets are hoping he can handle a starting cornerback slot. It's another position where if the Jets have an answer on the team right now, it is a huge relief going forward. And we'll discuss the test AZ Thomas faces as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're getting ready for Week 14 action. 5 games left in this Jets season. Jets may be out of the playoff race, but I really do think these 5 games matter. And one of the things I always say is that, it may be a bit of a cliche that you're trying to build a culture, but I really do think that matters for Aaron Glenn this season because this is a first-year situation. It's the start of a new rebuild, but as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you have a lot of young guys who are trying to show that they belong in the NFL. And of course, playing well on an individual basis does matter, but I think wins really validate guys at this point that to show that they belong in this league. Now, a player the Jets are hoping will develop into a starting caliber player is AZ Thomas. He, of course, was their 3rd round pick this year out of Florida State. If we're being honest, I think of all the picks that the Jets made in the NFL draft, this was the one that led the most eyebrows to be raised because at the time they made this deal, at the time they drafted AZ Thomas, it wasn't clear what his path to playing time would be. They had just signed Brandon Stevens to a pretty lucrative contract in free agency. At the time they had Sauce Gardner, and they were just a few months away from signing Sauce Gardner to a lucrative extension, which at the time made it seem like Sauce would be in New York through his prime. And it really feels like a long time ago. Michael Carter II seemed like a really solid option as the slot corner, and now Michael Carter II's gone. So there was a lot of question about where AZ Thomas fit in. The thing that I said at the time was that, you usually do not count on your 3rd round pick to step into the starting lineup right away. It happens far rarer than you'd think. And even when they do step into the starting lineup, they usually don't play that well. Well, that analysis ended up being wrong, like a lot of my predictions this year, because the Jets, of course, traded Sauce Gardner at the deadline, and that opened up a starting spot for AZ Thomas. And AZ Thomas actually stepped into the starting lineup before the Sauce Gardner trade. He started a game against Cincinnati when Gardner missed it with a concussion, and he got beaten deep for a touchdown by T. Higgins in that game, which happens to corners with far more experience than AZ Thomas. I mean, it's tough to get on a rookie for that. That's just a tough matchup. The Jets did not do a very good job on that play. I mean, if you're not going to get to the quarterback and you're leaving your rookie one-on-one who doesn't have a lot of experience against T. Higgins, you're just asking for a touchdown to happen. But other than that, I thought AZ Thomas actually held his own against the Bengals. And look, I'm not saying he's Sauce Gardner. He's not. I'm not saying he's ever going to be Sauce Gardner. He's probably not. But what I will say is that it does look like he's been holding his own when he's been out there. Now, he missed a game himself with an injury, but I don't think he looks overmatched, which is not always the case when you have a 3rd round pick stepping out into the field as a rookie. He's not giving up a whole lot. Now, the Jets are giving him their fair share of help, but I like where he's at right now. I think one of the themes with these Jets young guys is even if they're not dominating relative to where they should be in their careers, they're playing pretty well. This is going to be a test for AZ Thomas. You're going up against the Miami team that, maybe hasn't been the most prolific offense in the league this year. Of course, they are missing Tyreek Hill, who suffered a serious injury in the first meeting between these teams. But you are going up against Jalen Waddle, a receiver who has done big things against the Jets in the past, and a guy who, on his worst day, has a tremendous amount of speed. And I think this is going to be an intriguing matchup. Now, I think Waddle's going to go up against Brandon Stevens his fair share of time. I think the Dolphins will try and get him on the move. They'll try and create favorable matchups. But I think that means that they're going to try and test the rookie. Mike McDaniel, say what you will about him, I still think he's a pretty good offensive mind. I think that's a matchup the Jets. I think what you want to do as an offense is when you have a weapon like Waddle, you want to put him on a rookie. You want to test the rookie and see what he can do. Thomas has the tools to be a successful corner in this league. He's big, he's long. He can, in theory, he's got the tools to be a very successful press corner. And I would imagine what the Jets will want to do is they'll want to have Thomas disrupt Waddle at the line of scrimmage. When you're going up against a speed guy, one of the ways you can, kind of throw him off his game is by making contact within those first 5 yards. And it's particularly true against an offense like Miami. So many offenses in this league, it's a staple of the NFL. And I think with Miami, this goes more than most offenses. They're timing based. You want your receiver to be in a certain spot at a certain time. And that's why you get up on these receivers and jam them. Now, the fallback to the negative to a jam, the part of a jam that's dangerous is that if you miss, if you whiff, if you try and contact a guy in the first 5 yards and you don't connect, well, then you're kind of out of position. The receiver kind of leaves you behind. And with Waddle, that can mean a very big play. I want to say this for every player I've mentioned on the show today. This game is not a make or break for any of these guys. I think that we're too quick to judge players. I think we're too quick to crown players the next great thing when they have one big game. And I do think to an extent that's happened with Adonai Mitchell this week, although I'm very excited about him. I think we're too quick to, give up on players when they have one bad game. That happened with Adonai Mitchell on the Thursday night game against New England. Now it's happening a little bit with Jowon Briggs this week, a week after Jowon Briggs played very well against Baltimore. Briggs had a couple drops in the game against Atlanta. I don't want to go overboard if these guys play well or if they don't play well, because these games are really one data point in what hopefully will be long careers. But I think that this is going to be probably the most difficult matchup AZ Thomas has had since that game against Cincinnati. And I will start to get excited about him if he matches up with Waddle and he looks like he can hold his own. He looks like he can, more or less keep pace with Waddle. And if he plays press coverage well at the line of scrimmage, because this is not an easy test. Waddle's not the best receiver in the league, but he's a very, very difficult matchup. One of the things that separates the guys who can play corner in this league from the guys who can't is how you recover, how you deal with adversity when you do miss a jam. Do you panic or do you get yourself back into the play? That's going to be something worth watching in this game. And I think for so much of this Jets team, the results matter, but how you get to the results also matters. How does this team compete going forward? It's true on the macro level. It's true team wide, but it's also true on the micro level, watching individual players. AZ Thomas is a guy I'm going to have my eye on this week. He's a guy I'm going to have my eye on for the rest of the way. Right now, this Jets cornerback group, it's not really clear what they have. Brandon Stevens having an excellent season. I keep saying it, and I feel like I should keep saying it because we all doubted him. I'll count myself in that number. I questioned that move, but let's be honest. You questioned that move too. If I'm going to take the grief, I'm also going to point out that you said the same thing. I'm sure you said the same thing when the Jets signed Brandon Stevens, because that signing did not make a lot of sense at the time it was made. It's been a great signing. I can't believe I'm saying this. I can't believe I'm saying this based on the way Brandon Stevens started the season, because he was the worst player on the team the first couple weeks of the year. He's turned it around and is playing really well. Jarvis Brownlee Jr. in the slot, sounds like his status for this game is a bit up in the air. He's had good moments. He's had bad moments. Can he be the long-term solution at the slot corner spot? We'll find out going forward. And I think the same is true of AZ Thomas. The hope is that he can handle that spot. And it's very possible that the Jets have their starting trio at corner right now. If Stevens maintains his level of play, if Brownlee shows that he's a guy who can handle the slot, and if AZ Thomas steps up, if AZ Thomas shows that he can, be a quality corner. And that's a big deal, because again, this is not a Jets team that's really set in many spots. And corner is one of the most important spots in the modern NFL, and it's especially important in an Aaron Glenn type defense. So if these guys, and it's a big if, but if these guys show that they belong, it's a huge problem spot that's off the board for the Jets, and they can focus on other spots as they try and build their team. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Enjoy the game. We'll be back after it to break down what happens between the Jets and the Dolphins. Talk to you then.